Good evening and welcome to Middle-earth Theater. Yet once again, I'm not Alan Cummings, I'm Seth Meyers, and tonight I'd like to discuss Tolkien's epic fantasy, The Lord of the Rings, and what sort of meaning we can find from it, and what sort of Christian meaning we can find from it. Christians and non-Christians alike are kind of hard put to figure out exactly what it means. It's a great story. It's like watching Braveheart, good versus evil, but given especially that Tolkien himself was a devout Christian, practicing Catholic, he was one of the key people that helped lead C.S. Lewis, one of the big names in Christian writing in the 20th century, to becoming a Christian. There's a little bit of a challenge to figure out, from this epic adventure fantasy, what exactly the deep Christian meanings are that's in it. So that's what I'd like to address. Part of the answer to that question, what kind of meaning can we find, lies in the answer to another question. What makes a good story, and how did Tolkien answer that question? And it's perhaps instructive to compare that to how his good friend C.S. Lewis answered that question. They were famous friends, both literature professors at Oxford in the 20th century, mid-20th century, and Lewis is actually famous for, in the fiction world, for his Chronicles of Narnia, which is a very, I wouldn't say strict allegory, but very strongly allegorical in that there's the Aslan figure, the lion, who is Christ. When the little girl Lucy asks, well, how I'm in Narnia, but how do I make the connection between Narnia and my world, Earth One? She said, he answers, I am in your world, but there I have a different name. This is why you were brought to Narnia, that by knowing me here for a little while, you may know me better there. And Aslan, in other parts of the story, says these profound things like, every year you grow, you will find me bigger. And, it's a lot of devotional type insights, very profound, but, very allegorical. But Tolkien, it was a little bit more like Harry Potter with Horcruxes, where, the Christ elements are scattered throughout different characters and different elements of the story, if you want to compare it to Lewis's allegory of Christ. To Tolkien, a good story shows, quote, and I'm going to quote a few lines from Tolkien through this because you really you miss the subtlety and the depth and profoundness of the story when you just see the movie. So you just really can't, some of the words are just lost in translation, as they say. So he says, a good story shows, quote, shoreless seas and stars uncounted, beauty that is an enchantment and an everlasting peril, both joy and sorrow as sharp as swords. And to Tolkien, you get that sense watching the movie. It's great videography, filmography. It's set in a naturally beautiful, created world. But there are three parts to a story specifically that Tolkien would use. And this sets a little bit of the backdrop for examining how we get Tolkien's Christian faith out of the meaning of the story. So, first he said there has to be a recovery. You want your story, your fantasy, to show things as they were meant to be, he said. And in The Lord of the Rings, the landscapes are jaw-dropping, the men are almost larger than life, the race of men, and it just enriches the meaning, the senses. Secondly, there should be an escape from peril, from what he calls the oldest and deepest desire, the great escape, the escape from death. And as you watch the movie and you see, Aragorn sing his sad songs, there's a persistent sorrow at the decay of Middle Earth and, the glory that it used to be. This is partly where I bring in my Viking chessboard here. Tolkien was a medieval scholar. He studied Beowulf. In Beowulf, he and Lewis both liked the Norse mythology much better than the Latin and the Greek stories. And part of it was the preoccupation with death. And the Norse mythology said the gods are within time, doomed with their allies to death. Their battles are with the monsters in the outer darkness. And he compared it to the Roman and Latin stories. The gods are timeless and do not fear death. So it was just more visceral, more existential. So I can bring in my Viking chess taffel is what it's called. Just to get some brownie points with Adam to see if he's got this game. I have some of my Lord of the Rings Stratego pieces watching, but in the Viking chess, there's one king, a big king in the middle. Everybody moves like a rook. You surround him to capture him, but the way he wins is if he survives by escaping to one of the corners. Otherwise, he gets set on by the host of the dark forces there. So just a little color background there. But the main point, that lengthy introduction aside, or in front of us, behind us, I want to examine The Lord of the Rings in light of Tolkien's comment in a letter in 1958, where he said it is mainly concerned with death and immortality. And I'd like to make the claim that we, every viewer or reader, can understand Lord of the Rings as an extension of Tolkien's Christian faith by examining his views on the immortality of its characters. We can examine death and immortality by three key insights from Tolkien. The insights are to live humbly, live sacrificially, and live hopefully. To live humbly, I mean, the basic thing, the one ring of power, having a ring and making everyone serve you, that's pretty much the opposite of being humble, demanding to be served. But if you look at some of the characters, in Denethor, he says, if I could have my way, I would leave my chair to my son after me, who would be his own master and no wizard's pupil. He's much like Lewis described of his own self before his conversion. He said, I'd wanted, mad wish, to call my soul my own. Boromir, the son of Denethor, was described as proud and fearless, often rash, ever anxious for victory and his own glory. He compared to his brother Faramir, who Frodo described as a man less self-regarding, both sterner and wiser than his brother. He was also described as a bit of anachronism. He said, in these days, men are slow to believe that a captain can be wise and learned in the scrolls of lore and song. This is like Denethor not wanting to be a wizard's pupil. And yet he can still be a man of battle and swift in the field. So Faramir yields to wisdom greater than his own. He's at heart humble. And Frodo, a hobbit, is a naturally humble character. This is what people usually think of as the first lesson from The Lord of the Rings, but it's just part of the many lessons and insights Tolkien has. Hobbits are described as simple, happy people, growing and eating food occupied most of their time. They were, as a rule, generous and not greedy. And Gandalf gives Frodo the advice, all we have to decide is what to do with the time that is given to us. He's not trying to, he doesn't have the weight of the world on his shoulders, in a sense. He's just humbly going about trying to live his own life the way he should. Secondly, live sacrificially. This is perhaps the key to the Christian insights in Lord of the Rings. Gandalf is one of the key figures in this. As he lays down his life fighting off the Balrog at the end of the first movie, so that the fellowship can go on. It's much like Christ, where it says, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends. Frodo is described as having a bit of a priest role because he performs the sacrifice. He tosses the ring into the fires, but he's like Christ in that he bears the weight of the sin, of the burden in his own body. And he has to leave Middle Earth because he's not going to live long because of bearing that. And Aragorn similarly is described as his being sad and stern because of the doom that was laid upon him, yet hope dwelt ever in the depths of his heart. He too bears the burden of the ring in a sense. So finally, I'd like to move on to live hopefully. This is another point where you almost don't get it. I mean, you get the sense of hope from the movies, but when you read the words, it comes out much more explicitly. On his death, in the movie, Theoden goes to the hall of his great fathers and his ancestors, with honor and glory. But here, a minstrel sings at his funeral and describes hope he rekindled and in hope ended, over death, over dread, over doom lifted, out of loss, out of life, unto long glory. You can see Tolkien's Christian faith, working itself out here and how he describes these. Frodo has a dream. I mean, early on, and it gets realized at the end as he sails off in the elven boat, how the great curtain turned all to silver glass and was rolled back, and he beheld white shores, and beyond them a far green country under a swift sunrise. But it's made even the most explicit, I think, in Aragorn. When he describes at the end of his life, he lays down his life near the end. It's not. They show him dead, I think, in the movie. He actually kind of decided when to pass before his allotted 3 normal mortal lifetimes. But he describes to Arwen and I think others, he says, "In sorrow we must go, but not in despair. Behold, we are not bound forever to the circles of the world. Beyond them is more than memory." Aragorn is also, so he has the hope, it's implicit, the air's thick with it, as you would say. Estel is the name given to Aragorn when he's adopted by the elves at age 2, and it means hope in Elvish. He's described as the Elfstone, and Elisar the Elfstone, and Vinyatar the Renewer. The Elfstone is much like how Christ in Ephesians 2 is described as the cornerstone of the church. And he's described as a renewer or healer. Gandalf says of Aragorn, "The hands of the king are the hands of healing." Christ was famous for healing. In fact, that's one of his titles, that he was a healer. So, in conclusion, and very briefly, covering 1,300 pages, and 11 hours if you watch it straight through, the Lord of the Rings does show Tolkien's Christian faith, but in elements, not in a straight allegory. In the ways in which the characters live with Christian humility, they find life through sacrifice, and they live with hope. Thank you.
12 minutes. Gosh darn it.